My mother moved her entire family into my house while I was gone. My mother moved her parents, her 3 brothers, and her 2 sisters into my house while I was on a 5-day business trip to Seattle. She had a key because she was my mother. Because I trusted her. Because when I bought my first home at 28, she cried and said she was so proud of me, and I gave her a spare key for emergencies. I should have known then. The way her eyes swept across the living room, the way she asked about property values, the way she said, 3 bedrooms for just 1 person seems wasteful, doesn't it? The presentation in Seattle went perfectly. My boss confirmed my promotion to regional manager. I caught an earlier flight home to celebrate, pulled into my driveway at 2 instead of 8, and found 4 cars I didn't recognize crammed onto my lawn. My grandmother was rearranging my bookshelf when I walked through the door. My grandfather had his feet on my coffee table. My uncles were spread across my couch, and my aunts were painting their nails on my antique side table, the one I'd inherited from my father's mother, the one my mother always hated. Mom came out of the kitchen carrying sandwiches like she was hosting a party. Her face went white when she saw me. "You're home early," she said. "Why is your entire family in my house?" Grandma stood up, smiling that smile I'd seen my whole life, the one that preceded every guilt trip. "We're family! Your mother said you wouldn't mind. Such a beautiful home. We've already made ourselves comfortable." "Where are they staying?" My youngest uncle laughed from the couch. "Here, obviously. Your mom said you had plenty of room. 3 bedrooms sitting empty while we were cramped in that tiny apartment." That's when the reality hit me. The apartment they'd been evicted from. The one my mother had been secretly paying for with money she borrowed from me. The loans she never paid back. The emergencies that were always someone else's rent. "Start explaining," I told her in the kitchen, where they'd already reorganized my cabinets. My grandmother's china, the set from Dad's side, was stacked carelessly next to regular plates. Someone had ruined my cast iron pan. "They needed somewhere to go," Mom said, and her voice had that practiced innocence I'd heard my whole life. "You have all this space you never use. Family helps family. You don't move 7 people into someone's home without asking." Grandma walked in without knocking. "I assume your grandfather and I will take the master bedroom since we're the eldest. You can share the guest room with your mother." I actually laughed. "You think you're taking my bedroom? In my house that I pay for? Respect your elders." Grandma's voice went cold. "We're family. This is what family does." And there it was. The word that had controlled my entire life. Family. The reason I'd paid for my uncle's DUI lawyer. The reason I'd co-signed my aunt's car loan that destroyed my credit when she defaulted. The reason I'd given my mother $30,000 over 5 years that I'd never see again. "You have 1 hour to leave," I said. "All of you. If you're not gone, I'm calling the police." Mom grabbed my arm, her nails digging in the way they had when I was a child, and embarrassed her in public. "You can't kick out your own family." "Where will we go?" "Not my problem." "After everything I sacrificed for you?" Her voice cracked perfectly. "I raised you alone after your father left. I gave up everything. And this is how you repay me?" The guilt hit me like it always did. The old programming. The voice in my head that said I was selfish, ungrateful, that I owed her everything. But then I looked around my invaded home. My grandmother wearing my bathrobe. My uncle's cigarette burning a hole in my couch. My mother's family taking everything I'd built. "You didn't sacrifice anything," I said quietly. "Dad left because of you. He tried to get custody and you told the court he was abusive. He sent child support and you spent it on yourself. He died thinking I hated him because you intercepted every letter he ever sent me." The room went silent. "I found the box," I continued. "After you helped me move in. 23 letters. Birthday cards with checks you cashed. A letter he wrote before he died, begging me to understand." Mom's face shifted, the mask slipping. "That's when I changed my locks." "But you'd already made a copy, hadn't you?" Grandpa walked in holding a piece of paper. "Young lady, you're being unreasonable. We're family. You can't throw us out." He held up the paper. It was a deed transfer. My signature, forged, dated 3 months ago. "Your mother already signed the house over to us," he said, "for tax purposes. You agreed to it, remember?" I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm calling the police," I whispered. "Go ahead," Grandma smiled. "We have documentation." "You have nothing. That's what happens when you disrespect your family." I realized then that this had been planned for years. Every loan, every favor, every key I'd given away. My mother had been waiting for me to build something worth taking. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice before getting it unlocked. My fingers found 911 and I pressed the call button, forcing my voice to stay level even though everything inside me was screaming. Grandpa still held that forged deed like it was a winning lottery ticket, and Grandma's smile hadn't moved from her face. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was fraud. This was people trying to steal my house with fake papers, and I needed help right now. The operator answered on the second ring and asked what my emergency was. I explained as clearly as I could that 7 people had moved into my house without permission while I was away on a business trip. They had a forged document claiming I'd signed my house over to them 3 months ago, which was a complete lie. My actual deed was in my bedroom safe, along with all my mortgage statements proving I owned this place. The operator asked if I was in immediate danger, and I looked around my living room at my family members watching me with expressions ranging from angry to dismissive. I told her I didn't think they would hurt me physically, but they were refusing to leave and claiming they had legal ownership of my property. She said she was dispatching officers right away, and told me to stay on the line, which I did while standing there in my own kitchen feeling like an intruder. Mom tried to grab the phone from my hand, but I stepped back. Grandma said something about me being dramatic and making a scene over nothing. Hoy laughed from the couch and said the police would take one look at Grandpa's paperwork and tell me to stop wasting their time. I ignored all of them and kept the operator on the line, answering her questions about how many people were in the house and whether any of them had weapons. The 8 minutes until the officers arrived felt like 8 hours, with my family alternating between trying to convince me to hang up and telling each other not to worry because they had documentation. 2 patrol officers walked through my front door at exactly 2:17, according to my microwave clock, and the entire energy in my living room changed instantly. Grandma's confident smile got smaller. Grandpa stood up straighter and clutched his forged deed tighter. My uncles stopped sprawling across my couch and sat up like they were in church. The officers were calm and professional, asking me to explain the situation, and I showed them my driver's license with this address, then went to my bedroom and brought back my actual deed from the safe along with 6 months of mortgage statements and my most recent property tax bill. Everything had my name on it. Everything proved this was my house. The older officer took Grandpa's forged deed and examined it carefully under my living room lamp. He pointed something out to his partner, and they both looked at the document for a long moment before the younger officer radioed for a detective. The older officer started taking statements, beginning with me and writing down everything I said about coming home early from Seattle to find my family moved in. Then he moved to my family members, and I watched them get increasingly nervous as they gave conflicting stories about whether Mom had told them I'd agreed to this, or whether they'd just assumed I wouldn't mind. Grandma kept insisting the deed was legitimate and I'd signed it myself, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. The officers separated everyone into different rooms to get individual statements, and I could hear Bianca crying in the guest bedroom while she talked to the younger officer. Detective Enrique Gupta arrived about 40 minutes after the patrol officers, carrying a leather folder and wearing a tired expression that suggested he'd seen situations like this before. He was maybe in his 50s with gray hair and calm eyes that took in my invaded living room without any visible reaction. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and asked to see both deeds. I gave him my real one, and Grandpa handed over the forged version with less confidence than he'd shown me earlier. Detective Gupta photographed both documents from multiple angles, then spent several minutes examining the forged deed with a magnifying glass he pulled from his folder. He asked Grandpa where he'd gotten the document, and Grandpa said Mom had brought it to him last month, saying I'd signed it for tax purposes but forgotten to mention it to them. Detective Gupta's expression didn't change, but he wrote that down and asked Mom if that was accurate. Mom launched into her crying routine, the one where her voice gets all shaky and her eyes fill with tears, but nothing actually falls down her cheeks. She told Detective Gupta this was all a terrible misunderstanding, and I was overreacting to a simple family disagreement about living arrangements. She said she'd never meant for things to get so blown out of proportion, and couldn't we all just sit down and talk about this like adults? Detective Gupta let her finish, then cut through her performance by pointing out that forging legal documents was a felony under state law, regardless of family relationships. He asked her directly if she had created the fake deed. Mom's face went pale, and she said she wanted to talk to a lawyer before answering any more questions. Detective Gupta nodded like he'd expected that response and made another note. The detective told my family they had 30 minutes to gather their belongings and leave my property. He explained that they were now officially trespassing since I'd formally asked them to go, and they had no legal right to be here. Grandma started protesting loudly about having nowhere to go, and how could I throw my own grandparents onto the street? Detective Gupta's voice stayed calm but firm as he explained that having nowhere else to stay was not a legal justification for occupying someone else's home through fraudulent documents. He said if they weren't gone in 30 minutes, he would arrest everyone for trespassing and they could figure out their housing situation from jail. That finally shut Grandma up. While my family packed their stuff, I called a 24-hour locksmith service I found online and scheduled an emergency rekey for tonight. The woman on the phone said they could have someone here within 2 hours, and I said that was perfect. Detective Gupta overheard and nodded his approval, then suggested I also consider installing a security system with cameras given my family's demonstrated willingness to invade my space. He handed me a business card for a company his sister used after her ex-husband kept breaking in. I took the card and added calling them to my mental list of things to do as soon as my family was gone. My uncles moved slowly and deliberately, making snide comments just loud enough for me to hear about how I was destroying the family over nothing. Dong said I'd regret this betrayal for the rest of my life. Nam said I was proving I'd never really been part of this family anyway. Hui said something about blood being thicker than water, and how I'd learned that lesson the hard way. Detective Gupta was standing near enough to overhear, and he turned to face them directly. He said any threats or harassment would result in additional charges being filed, and if they contacted me in any way after leaving this property, he would personally ensure they spent time in jail. The three of them shut up immediately and went back to packing without another word. Mom tried one last manipulation attempt in the kitchen while I was getting a glass of water. She grabbed my arm the way she used to when I was a kid, and she wanted to make sure I was listening. She whispered that I was making a terrible mistake that would haunt me forever, that family was supposed to forgive each other, that I'd be all alone if I went through with this. I pulled my arm away and looked at her directly. I told her she made her choices when she forged my signature and tried to steal my house, and now she got to live with the consequences of those choices, just like I'd lived with the consequences of trusting her. Her face shifted from pleading to cold in an instant, and I saw the real person under the mask she'd worn my whole life. She walked away without another word and finished packing her bags. The locksmith's van pulled up just as Nam was loading the last garbage bag into his trunk. I stood on my porch and watched 4 cars pull away from my lawn, their tires leaving tracks in the grass. The locksmith was a guy in his 40s with a tool belt and a clipboard, and he got started right away without asking questions. Detective Gupta stayed on the porch with me while the locksmith worked on the front door, explaining that I should file the full report tomorrow and bring all my documentation. He handed me his card and said to call if anyone from my family tried to contact me or come back. The locksmith moved through my house, changing every lock, front door, back door, garage door, and I followed him around like I was seeing the place for the first time. Detective Gupta left after the family was gone, and I was alone with the locksmith drilling out cylinders and installing new hardware. He finished in 40 minutes and handed me 3 sets of keys, and I paid him in cash because I didn't want this charge showing up anywhere Mom might see it. After he left, I walked through every room cataloging what they'd done. My bedroom had been gone through, drawers opened, closet disturbed, like they'd been looking for valuables or documents. The antique side table from Dad's grandmother had a deep scratch across the top where someone had dragged something heavy. My kitchen cabinets were completely reorganized, everything in the wrong place, and my cast iron pan sat in the sink with rust spots from whoever had washed it with soap. I found my bathrobe on the bathroom floor, my towels used and left in a pile, my personal spaces invaded in ways that made my skin crawl. I got a notebook and started making lists, writing down every single thing that was damaged or moved or violated. The locksmith had left his invoice on the counter, and I added that to the pile of documentation I was building. My phone buzzed with texts from Mom, but I didn't read them, just took screenshots and saved them to a folder labeled Evidence. That night, I couldn't sleep even though the locks were new and the house was mine again. Every sound made me jump up and check the windows, convinced I'd see Grandpa's car in the driveway or Mom's face pressed against the glass. I kept my phone next to me on the nightstand with Detective Gupta's number pulled up, ready to call if anyone came back. The promotion I'd gotten in Seattle felt like something that happened to someone else, some other version of me who hadn't come home to find her entire family squatting in her house. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and realized they'd stolen my celebration, my achievement, my moment of pride, and turned my homecoming into this nightmare that wouldn't end even after they left. Morning came and I called my boss from the kitchen, explaining that I needed emergency personal leave because of a family crisis involving police and potential legal action. My voice shook when I said it out loud, making it real in a way it hadn't been before. She didn't ask for details, just told me to take the full week and not to worry about work. She said my promotion wasn't going anywhere, and my well-being came first, and I almost started crying at how supportive she was being. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my kitchen table feeling exhausted, even though it was only 8 in the morning. I drove to the county records office as soon as it opened, bringing all my documents in a folder I'd organized the night before. The clerk was a woman in her 60s who listened to my explanation with growing horror. her face getting paler as I described the forged deed and my family's invasion. She immediately pulled up my property records on her computer and confirmed that nothing had been filed, that my deed was intact and legitimate. Then she flagged my property with fraud protection notices that would prevent any unauthorized transfer attempts, making notes in the system that would trigger alerts if anyone tried to submit paperwork. She printed out confirmation of the fraud alert and stapled it to my authentic deed, and I felt some of the panic ease knowing there was now a barrier between my family and my house. The clerk suggested I get certified copies of everything: my deed, my mortgage documents, my property tax records, explaining these would be crucial evidence for both criminal charges and any civil case I might pursue. She walked me through the process of ordering copies, filling out forms and paying fees, and recommended I store everything in a safe deposit box away from my home where my family couldn't get to it. I thanked her multiple times, grateful for how seriously she was taking this, how she understood that this wasn't just a family disagreement but actual fraud. I left the records office with a stack of certified documents and drove straight to my bank to rent a safe deposit box, storing copies of everything where Mom could never find them. Detective Gupta called that afternoon while I was sitting on my couch staring at nothing. He needed me to come to the station tomorrow morning for a formal interview, explaining he needed detailed statements about my family's history of financial exploitation. I agreed immediately and wrote down the time, then spent the rest of the day mentally preparing to recount years of manipulation and stolen money. Every loan I'd given Mom that was never repaid, every emergency that turned out to be someone else's rent, every time she'd guilted me into opening my wallet. The intercepted letters from Dad, the lies about him being abusive, the checks she'd cashed from his birthday cards. I made notes on my phone so I wouldn't forget anything when I was sitting across from the detective trying to explain how my own mother had been systematically robbing me for almost a decade. That evening, I finally let myself cry, sitting on my couch in my reclaimed house and processing what had actually happened. Mom hadn't just tried to take my house. She'd tried to erase my independence and reduce me back to the controlled child who never questioned her authority. The forged deed wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, calculated, the culmination of years of testing my boundaries and learning how much she could take. I cried until my face hurt, and my eyes were swollen, grieving the mother I'd thought I had, and accepting the reality of the one who'd raised me. I spent hours going through my financial records, pulling up bank statements and loan documents and text messages about emergencies. Every time I'd transferred money to Mom's account, every check I'd written, every time I'd covered rent or utilities or legal fees for her family. The total kept climbing as I found things I'd initially forgotten, amounts I'd written off as helping family, and by the time I finished it exceeded $40,000. $40,000 over 9 years. Money I'd earned and saved and handed over because family helps family. I realized I'd been funding their dysfunction since I was 19, since my first real job, and Mom had been cultivating me as a resource since I was barely an adult. The next morning, I drove to the police station and gave Detective Gupta a comprehensive statement covering everything. The $30,000 in documented loans, the additional $10,000 in cash and checks and transfers. The 23 letters from Dad that Mom had intercepted and hidden. Her pattern of manipulation starting when I was a child, the guilt trips and emotional blackmail and lies about my father. The timeline of the invasion, how she'd used her emergency key while I was in Seattle, how she'd planned this for months or maybe years. Detective Gupta took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions, and when I finished, he explained that this established motive and pattern of behavior that would strengthen the forgery case significantly. He said the prosecutor would want to interview me too, that my testimony about the financial exploitation would demonstrate this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a calculated crime. Detective Gupta walked me to a different office down the hall, where a woman with kind eyes and graying hair stood from behind her desk. She extended her hand and introduced herself as Shanti Gupta, a victim advocate who worked with the police department on family exploitation cases. Her handshake was firm and warm, and something about her calm presence made the tight knot in my chest loosen slightly. She gestured to a comfortable chair and sat across from me, not behind the desk like Detective Gupta had, and that small choice made me feel less like I was interrogated and more like I was helped. She explained that family-based financial abuse was far more common than most people realized, that predators often targeted their own relatives because the guilt and obligation made perfect cover for theft and manipulation. I listened as she described patterns I recognized immediately, the loan requests that became expectations, the emergencies that were never really emergencies, the way boundaries got eroded slowly until there weren't any left. She offered resources for therapy and legal support, sliding a folder across the small table between us with printed information about counselors who specialized in family trauma. I took the folder with shaking hands and thanked her, my voice cracking slightly because someone finally understood that this wasn't just a family disagreement, this was abuse dressed up in obligation and guilt. Shanti leaned forward and told me something that hit harder than anything Detective Gupta had said. She explained that my guilt response to setting boundaries wasn't evidence that I was wrong or selfish. It was the result of years of conditioning designed specifically to keep me compliant. Mom had trained me from childhood to feel responsible for her happiness and her family's well-being, to believe that saying no made me a bad daughter, that protecting my own interests meant I was cruel and ungrateful. The guilt wasn't my conscience speaking, it was my abuser's voice replaying in my head, and learning to recognize the difference would take time and work. She recommended a therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim, who specialized in manipulation recovery and family trauma, someone who could help me untangle the programming and build healthy boundaries without the crushing guilt that came with them. I pulled out my phone right there in her office and called Dr. Kim's practice, scheduling an appointment for the following Tuesday, because waiting felt impossible now that I knew help existed. Shanti smiled when I hung up and told me that taking that step, making that call, was harder than most people realized, and I should be proud of myself for doing it. Back in Detective Gupta's office, he explained that the investigation would take several weeks as they worked to verify the forgery through forensic analysis and interview my family members separately. They needed to build a solid criminal case that would hold up in court, which meant documenting everything carefully and giving my family enough rope to either cooperate or dig themselves deeper. He leaned back in his chair and asked me a question I hadn't fully considered yet. Did I want to pursue charges against just the person who created the forgery, or against everyone who participated in the invasion scheme knowing the deed was fake? His pen was poised over his notepad, waiting for my answer, and I realized this decision would determine whether I was protecting myself or declaring war on my entire family. The weight of that choice pressed down on me as I sat there trying to think clearly through the exhaustion and anger. I left the police station without giving him a final answer, telling him I needed time to think about the scope of charges. The drive home felt longer than usual as my mind spun through scenarios and consequences. If I only went after the forger, probably Mom, then everyone else could claim they were innocent victims of her manipulation. But if I pursued charges against everyone who knowingly participated, I'd be sending aunts and uncles and maybe even grandparents to jail for fraud and conspiracy. The guilt tried to creep back in, whispering that family didn't do this to each other, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I spent hours that evening sitting on my couch, staring at my phone, trying to decide if wanting accountability made me as bad as them. Finally, I called Shanti's office number and left a message asking if she had time to talk through this decision, because I couldn't trust my own judgment anymore. Shanti called back within an hour, even though it was past normal business hours, and listened as I explained my dilemma. Her response was gentle but firm. She reminded me that I didn't create this situation. My family did through their choices and their willingness to participate in fraud. Protecting myself wasn't the same as attacking them, and holding people accountable for criminal behavior wasn't revenge. It was justice. She asked me a question that shifted my entire perspective. If a stranger had forged my signature and invaded my home with 6 accomplices, would I hesitate to pursue charges against all of them? The answer was obviously no, and she pointed out that being related to criminals didn't make their crimes less serious. It actually made them worse because they exploited the trust that came with family bonds. I thanked her and hung up feeling clearer about what I needed to do, even though the guilt still gnawed at the edges of my resolve. The next morning, I called Detective Gupta and told him my decision. I wanted to pursue charges against whoever created the forged deed and anyone who knowingly participated in the fraud, but I requested leniency for family members who might have genuinely been manipulated into thinking the arrangement was legitimate. He was quiet for a moment, then told me that approach demonstrated more compassion than my family had shown me, and he respected the balance I was trying to strike. He said the investigation would proceed with that framework in mind, interviewing everyone separately to determine who knew what and when. I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified, knowing I'd just set in motion a process that would probably destroy what was left of my family relationships, but also knowing I couldn't let them get away with trying to steal my house. Mom started calling that same afternoon, and by the end of 3 days she'd left 14 voicemails that I saved, but didn't listen to immediately. When I finally forced myself to play them back, they cycled through every manipulation tactic she'd ever used. The first few were tearful apologies claiming she'd made a terrible mistake and just wanted to help her struggling family. The middle ones turned angry, accusing me of being cruel and heartless and destroying everyone's lives over a misunderstanding. The final ones contained barely veiled threats about family consequences and how I'd regret choosing outsiders over blood. I saved every single message as potential evidence and didn't respond to any of them, following Shanti's advice about maintaining no contact during the investigation. Each time my phone rang with Mom's number, I felt my stomach clench, but I also felt my resolve getting stronger because her messages proved exactly what Shanti had explained about manipulation and guilt tactics. Grandma apparently got my work email somehow, probably from Mom's records, and sent a long message that appeared in my inbox 4 days after the police removed them from my house. She wrote about family loyalty and respecting elders and how I was destroying everyone's lives over what she called a simple misunderstanding about property arrangements. The email was perfectly crafted to hit every guilt button I had, reminding me of family dinners and childhood memories and all the times they'd supposedly been there for me. I read it once, felt the familiar guilt trying to take hold, then forwarded the entire thing to Detective Gupta and blocked her email address. Something had shifted in me during those conversations with Shanti and the detective. Each manipulation attempt, instead of making me question myself, actually strengthened my determination to see this through, because it proved they hadn't changed at all and weren't planning to. The security company arrived on schedule 2 days later, and I watched as they installed cameras at every entrance and a comprehensive alarm system with sensors on all the windows and doors. The technician showed me how to use the app on my phone to monitor everything remotely, how to set different alarm modes, how to get instant notifications if any sensor was triggered. I tested every single sensor obsessively that first night, opening and closing windows and doors to make sure the alerts worked, checking the camera feeds to verify the angles covered my entire property. The system gave me back some sense of safety in my own home, knowing I'd have warning if anyone tried to approach my house without permission. I still jumped at random noises and checked the locks multiple times before bed, but I slept slightly better that night than I had since finding my family in my living room. 1 week after the invasion, Detective Gupta called with an update that made my hands shake. Forensic analysis had confirmed beyond any doubt that the deed was forged, and they'd identified Mom as the likely creator based on handwriting analysis and some digital forensics I didn't fully understand. He was bringing her in for formal questioning the next day and wanted to know if I would testify if charges were filed. The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment where I either backed down or fully committed to holding her accountable. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I told him yes, I would testify, whatever the case needed. I hung up feeling surprised by my own certainty. 2 weeks ago, I would have crumbled under the pressure and guilt, would have found a way to excuse her behavior or minimize the damage. But Shanti's counseling had helped me understand that protecting myself wasn't betrayal, that my family's attempts at guilt manipulation were actually proof of their continued abuse, rather than evidence of my cruelty. The more they tried to twist my boundaries into attacks, the more certain I became that cutting them off completely was the only way to build a life free from their exploitation. I looked around my quiet house, my safe space that I'd worked so hard to afford, and felt something close to peace, knowing I was finally fighting back against people who'd been stealing from me for almost a decade. Gracie Wallace called 2 days later while I was organizing paperwork at my kitchen table, and I grabbed the phone on the second ring. She introduced herself as the forensic document examiner Detective Gupta had hired and asked if I had time to discuss her findings about the forged deed. I told her yes and pulled out my notebook to take notes while she walked me through her analysis. She explained that my actual signature had consistent pressure patterns and specific letter formations that the forged version completely missed. The person who created the fake deed had tried to copy my signature from something, but didn't understand the underlying mechanics of how I actually write. The notary seal was another major problem because it belonged to a notary who'd retired 8 years ago and moved to Florida, which meant someone had either stolen an old stamp or created a fake one. The paper stock was wrong too, since official county documents used a specific watermarked paper that the forged deed didn't have. She told me her report documented all these inconsistencies with photographs and technical analysis that would be extremely difficult for any defense attorney to challenge. I thanked her and hung up feeling something close to vindication, knowing the evidence was this strong. Shanti had recommended Roger Wallace, a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes and family fraud cases, so I scheduled an appointment for the following week. His office was in a converted house downtown with comfortable furniture and walls covered in legal certificates. Roger was probably 60 with gray hair and reading glasses that he kept pushing up his nose while reviewing the documentation I'd brought. I'd spent hours organizing everything into labeled folders, including bank statements showing the loans, text messages where Mom asked for money, emails about emergencies, and my own timeline of financial exploitation going back almost 10 years. He went through each folder carefully, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions about specific transactions. After about an hour, he leaned back in his chair and told me I had extremely strong grounds for a civil lawsuit seeking return of the loans plus damages for the invasion, emotional distress, and property damage. The criminal case would help establish the facts, but I could pursue financial recovery separately, regardless of how the criminal charges played out. He explained that documenting everything this thoroughly was exactly what judges wanted to see in family fraud cases, because it proved the exploitation wasn't just a misunderstanding, but a calculated pattern. Roger warned me that actually collecting money from family members who'd just been evicted and clearly had no assets would be extremely difficult even with a judgment. He said I could potentially garnish wages if anyone got employment or put liens on any property they acquired in the future, but realistically, I shouldn't expect to see much of the money anytime soon. I told him I understood the practical limitations, but wanted the legal judgment anyway, because I needed formal acknowledgement of what they'd done. A court ruling would create a permanent record that couldn't be rewritten or minimized by family stories. It would also protect me against future claims if they ever tried to argue I'd given them the money as gifts, or owed them something. Roger nodded and said plenty of his clients pursued cases for those exact reasons, knowing that justice and validation mattered even when financial recovery was unlikely. We discussed his fees and I signed the initial paperwork to retain him, feeling like I was building a wall of legal protection around myself brick by brick. My first therapy appointment arrived on a Thursday afternoon at an office in a medical building near the hospital. The therapist's waiting room had soft lighting and nature photographs that were probably supposed to be calming, but just made me more nervous. I filled out intake forms asking about family history, mental health background and current symptoms, checking boxes for anxiety, difficulty sleeping, and intrusive thoughts. The therapist called me back after 15 minutes and introduced herself with a warm handshake before gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. She asked me to start wherever felt natural, so I began with finding my family in my house and the forged deed, then backtracked to explain the years of loans and manipulation that led up to that moment. Talking through the full history out loud to a stranger made me realize how deeply the dysfunction ran and how much I'd normalized over the years. The therapist listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes but mostly maintaining steady eye contact that made me feel heard rather than judged. When I mentioned Mom intercepting Dad's letters, she stopped me and asked me to sit with that for a moment because what I was describing wasn't just cruel, but actually criminal interference with parental rights and mail fraud. I'd never thought of it in those terms before, always framing it as Mom being protective or controlling, rather than recognizing it as serious crimes that destroyed my relationship with my father. The session ran over time as I worked through these realizations, and I left feeling emotionally wrung out, but somehow lighter. Detective Gupta called 3 weeks after the invasion on a Tuesday morning while I was at work. He told me Mom had been arrested an hour ago and was currently being processed at the county jail on charges of forgery, fraud, and attempted theft by deception. The arrest had happened at her parents' house where she'd apparently been staying since the eviction from my property. He explained that the forensic evidence combined with Grandpa's statement had given the prosecutor enough to file formal charges, and Mom would be arraigned tomorrow morning. I thanked him for letting me know directly rather than leaving me to hear about it through family channels, though I mentioned I hadn't heard from any family members since they'd left my house. He said that wasn't surprising since people often cut contact when criminal investigations got serious, hoping silence would somehow make the consequences disappear. After hanging up, I sat at my desk processing the information and feeling a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Part of me had still hoped Mom would somehow make this right, would acknowledge what she'd done and try to repair the damage. The arrest made it clear that wasn't going to happen. My phone rang from a blocked number the next day while I was making dinner, and I answered without thinking because I was expecting a call from the security company about a sensor issue. A man's voice started screaming before I could even say hello, and I recognized my Uncle Dong's voice telling me I'd destroyed Mom's life, and the whole family would make sure I paid for this betrayal. He called me ungrateful and selfish and said I'd turned my back on everyone who'd ever helped me. I fumbled for my phone's voice memo app and managed to start recording about 15 seconds into his rant. He kept going for almost 3 minutes, his voice getting louder and more threatening, saying the family would never forgive me and I'd regret choosing the police over my own blood. When he finally stopped to breathe, I hung up without saying anything. My hands were shaking, but I immediately forwarded the audio file to Detective Gupta, with a text explaining what had just happened. He called back within 10 minutes and told me to document any other contact attempts and that he'd be adding harassment charges based on this recording. Detective Gupta worked fast because 2 days later he called to tell me he'd secured a restraining order protecting me from all 7 family members who'd participated in the invasion. The judge had granted it immediately after hearing the threatening call and reviewing the pattern of manipulation and fraud. The order prohibited any contact, including phone calls, emails, text messages, social media messages, or physical approaches. If anyone violated it, they'd face immediate arrest and additional criminal charges. Gupta explained that copies were being served to each family member today, and I should call 911 immediately if anyone tried to contact me. I felt safer knowing legal boundaries now backed up my personal ones, that I didn't have to rely on just my own ability to say no when they inevitably tried more manipulation. The restraining order made it official that their behavior had crossed legal lines, and that the court system recognized them as threats to my safety. Mom made bail the next morning, probably with money from her parents, and I spent the whole day bracing for some kind of escalation. I kept checking my security cameras and jumping at every notification on my phone. But nothing happened. No calls, no visits, no messages through third parties. The complete silence was somehow more unsettling than the previous harassment because I couldn't see what they were planning or preparing. I mentioned this to Shanti during our next check-in, and she explained that silence was often a manipulation tactic too, designed to make me anxious and wondering and maybe even guilty enough to reach out first. She reminded me that I didn't owe them communication or explanation, and that the restraining order meant I was legally protected from having to deal with their attempts at contact. Still, I found myself checking the cameras obsessively and sleeping poorly, my brain convinced that the silence meant they were plotting something worse. My therapy sessions over the next few weeks focused on processing the grief of losing my family, even though they were toxic. The therapist helped me understand that mourning the family I wished I had was different from wanting back the family I actually had, and both feelings could exist at the same time without contradicting each other. I could grieve the mother-daughter relationship I'd always hoped for, while still maintaining boundaries against the mother I actually got. I could miss having grandparents and aunts and uncles in my life, while recognizing that the specific people who filled those roles had only ever hurt me. She introduced concepts like ambiguous loss and complicated grief that helped me make sense of why I felt sad about cutting off people who'd treated me so badly. The sessions were hard work, often leaving me crying in my car afterward, but I started sleeping better and feeling less guilty about my choices. Roger filed the civil lawsuit 6 weeks after the invasion, and I had to sign off on a complaint that ran almost 30 pages documenting every loan, every manipulation, every invasion of my space and privacy. Seeing everything laid out in legal language with section numbers and exhibits made the exploitation feel more real and less like normal family dynamics. The complaint sought return of $40,000 in loans plus damages for emotional distress, property damage, invasion of privacy, and legal fees. Roger explained that we were asking for a significant amount because we wanted room to negotiate if it went to settlement, though he still cautioned that actually collecting would be difficult. I told him I understood but wanted them to see in black and white exactly what they'd taken from me over the years and what the court system thought about their behavior. I walked back into my office building on Monday morning, and the familiar lobby felt strange after everything that had happened. My badge worked, my parking spot was still there, and people nodded hello like nothing had changed, but I felt like I'd lived 3 separate lifetimes in the past 6 weeks. My boss called me into her office before I even reached my desk, and I braced myself for bad news, some corporate excuse about how they needed to let me go due to my personal situation. Instead, she asked how I was doing and whether I needed more time, her face showing actual concern instead of the fake sympathy I'd gotten used to from my family. She made it clear my job was completely secure, and that everyone understood I'd been dealing with a serious crisis, which made my throat tight because I wasn't used to people supporting me without expecting something in return. The promotion announcement went out that afternoon in a company-wide email, officially naming me regional manager with a substantial raise and expanded responsibilities. Colleagues stopped by my desk all day to congratulate me, shaking my hand and saying they knew I'd earned it, and I accepted their praise while thinking about how none of them had any idea what I'd been surviving behind these professional smiles. I didn't tell anyone about the invasion or the forgery or the restraining orders, because work was the one place where I was still just myself, still competent and respected and valued for what I could do, rather than what I could provide. The structure and routine of work became my anchor over the following weeks, giving me 8 hours each day where I focused on quarterly reports and team meetings instead of lawyers and prosecutors. I built this career through my own effort and skill, working late nights and taking on extra projects and proving myself in ways that had nothing to do with family connections or borrowed money. My family had tried to take my house and my savings and my peace of mind, but they couldn't touch my competence or my professional reputation or the future I was still building despite their attempts to destroy me. Every successful presentation and solved problem reminded me that I was capable and strong and deserving of the life I'd created, even when Mom's voice in my head tried to tell me I was selfish and ungrateful. The promotion meant more responsibility and longer hours, but I welcomed the distraction and threw myself into learning my new role with an intensity that my team probably found excessive. Detective Gupta called me 3 weeks after Mom's arrest with news that made my stomach drop. Grandpa had agreed to testify against Mom in exchange for reduced charges, admitting under questioning that she'd created the forged deed and convinced him it was a legitimate tax document. He claimed he'd believed her story about protecting family assets, and had no idea the signature was forged until detectives showed him the analysis, which might have been true, or might have been a convenient lie to save himself. Either way, the betrayal didn't surprise me anymore, because I'd learned over the past months that my family would sacrifice anyone to avoid consequences, throwing each other under buses with the same ease they'd used me for money. Gupta explained that Grandpa's testimony would strengthen the criminal case significantly, since he could describe Mom's planning and manipulation in detail, making it harder for her attorney to claim the forgery was some kind of accident or misunderstanding. I thanked him for the update and hung up feeling numb rather than victorious, because watching my family turn on each other just proved they'd never actually cared about loyalty or unity, only about avoiding punishment. Roger called 2 days later to tell me that Mom's attorney had reached out about a potential plea deal. The proposal was straightforward. Mom would plead guilty to reduced charges if I agreed to drop the civil suit, essentially trading criminal accountability for financial consequences. Roger explained this was a common tactic when defendants knew they'd lose at trial, but wanted to avoid paying damages, accepting probation or minimal jail time while protecting whatever assets they might have. He walked me through the pros and cons in his calm attorney voice, noting that a plea deal would save me the stress of testifying at trial, and guarantee at least some criminal conviction, even if it meant giving up my chance to recover the $40,000 she'd taken over the years. I listened to his analysis while staring at my computer screen at work, pretending to review a spreadsheet while actually processing the idea of letting Mom escape financial responsibility. I told Roger I refused the deal without hesitation, my voice steady and certain in a way that surprised both of us. I wanted both criminal accountability and civil judgment, because I was tired of making things easier for people who'd never made anything easier for me. Tired of being the one who compromised and sacrificed and gave up what I was owed. Roger warned me this decision meant potentially going to trial, which would be emotionally difficult, and require me to testify about years of exploitation and manipulation in front of strangers and probably my family. He explained that trials were unpredictable, and that even strong cases could have unexpected outcomes, so I needed to be prepared for the possibility that we might lose, or that the jury might award less than we were seeking. I understood all of that, and I still refused the deal because I needed Mom to face real consequences for once in her life, needed a court to officially acknowledge what she'd done, instead of letting her slide by with another manipulation and another escape. The prosecutor handling Mom's criminal case scheduled a meeting with me the following week to begin trial preparation. She was a serious woman in her 40s who'd apparently handled dozens of fraud cases and knew exactly how defense attorneys would try to attack my credibility and paint me as the villain. We sat in a conference room at the courthouse while she explained what testimony would involve, how I'd need to describe the invasion and the forged deed, and the years of financial exploitation in clear, factual terms without getting emotional or defensive. She warned me that Mom's attorney would try to make me seem cold and ungrateful, would bring up every time I'd helped my family and suggest I was now turning on them out of spite rather than genuine harm. I felt my hands shaking as she described the cross-examination process, but I told her I was ready, especially after she reviewed my documentation and evidence and said this was one of the strongest cases she'd handled in terms of proof. 3 months after the invasion, the civil case finally moved forward with depositions where my family members had to answer questions under oath. Roger attended each deposition and reported back to me afterward, describing how their stories contradicted each other constantly, as everyone tried to minimize their own involvement while blaming Mom. Grandma claimed she'd thought the deed was legitimate and had no idea about the forgery, while my uncles said they'd only moved in because Mom told them I'd agreed to help family. My aunts gave variations on the same theme, painting themselves as innocent victims of Mom's manipulation, rather than willing participants in the invasion. Roger said the contradictions would help demonstrate the conspiracy at trial because it showed they'd all known something was wrong, but had chosen to go along anyway, prioritizing their own needs over my rights or property. Bianca broke down during her deposition according to Roger, crying and admitting she'd known something was wrong, but had gone along because she desperately needed a place to stay after her eviction. Her honesty was refreshing compared to the others' carefully constructed lies, and Roger said her testimony would actually help our case by demonstrating that everyone involved had at least suspected the deed was questionable. He explained that her admission of knowledge would make it harder for the others to claim complete innocence, since if Bianca had doubts, then they probably all did. I felt a strange mix of sympathy and anger toward her, understanding her desperation while still resenting that she'd chosen to violate my home rather than find another solution. My therapy sessions shifted during this period to processing my father's death and the relationship Mom had stolen from us both. This hurt even more than the recent invasion, because it represented decades of loss rather than one terrible incident, years of birthday cards and letters and attempts at connection that I'd never received. I started writing letters to Dad that I'd never send, filling pages with apologies and explanations and the life updates he'd missed, telling him about my house and my promotion, and how I'd finally learned the truth about Mom's lies. My therapist encouraged this practice as a way to grieve the relationship we should have had while acknowledging the reality that he was gone, and I'd never get those years back. Some sessions left me crying so hard I could barely drive home, mourning not just Dad but the childhood I should have had with a father who'd actually loved me and tried to reach me. The prosecutor called Roger 6 weeks before the scheduled trial date with a final plea offer for Mom. She would plead guilty to forgery and fraud, accept probation with strict restitution terms, and the harassment charges would be dropped entirely. Mom's attorney was apparently pushing hard for her to accept because he was afraid of how bad the trial testimony would make her look, especially with Grandpa's cooperation and all the documentation I'd provided. Roger forwarded me the offer details and asked what I wanted to do, reminding me that this would guarantee at least some restitution payments and a criminal conviction without the stress of trial. I sat with the decision for 2 days, weighing my desire for full accountability against the practical reality that probation with restitution might be the best outcome I could realistically achieve. I told Roger I'd take the plea deal, then spent the next 2 days second-guessing myself. The prosecutor called on Thursday morning with news that changed everything. Mom had rejected the deal. Her attorney explained she was convinced she could win at trial by painting me as an ungrateful daughter who abandoned her struggling family. I hung up and stared at my phone, feeling fury rise in my chest, but no surprise at all. This was the same narcissism that had driven her entire life, the absolute certainty that she could manipulate any situation to her advantage. She genuinely believed a jury would side with her over the daughter she'd tried to rob. The prosecutor scheduled a meeting for the following week to begin trial preparation. The next month became a blur of practice sessions and coaching. The prosecutor, a woman named Janet with 20 years of experience, walked me through every aspect of testimony. She explained how defense attorneys would try to rattle me, how they'd twist my words, how they'd make me seem cold and vindictive. We practiced my responses over and over until I could tell my story clearly and simply without getting emotional. Janet taught me to focus on facts rather than feelings, to answer only what was asked, to pause before responding. She showed me videos of other witnesses who'd handled cross-examination well, pointing out how they stayed calm even when attorneys got aggressive. We practiced with her colleague playing Mom's defense attorney, throwing every nasty question and accusation they could think of. By the end of the month, I could describe finding my family in my house and seeing that forged deed without my voice shaking. The criminal trial began 4 months after the invasion, on a cold Tuesday morning in November. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom for 3 hours before they called me to testify, my stomach twisting itself into knots. When I finally took the stand, Mom sat at the defense table looking small and sad, wearing a conservative blue dress I'd never seen before. Her attorney was a thin man in his 50s who smiled at me like we were old friends. The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened when I came home early from Seattle. I told the jury about finding 4 cars on my lawn, my grandmother rearranging my bookshelf, my family spread throughout my house like they owned it. I described Grandpa presenting the forged deed with my signature on it, claiming I'd agreed to sign my house over for tax purposes. Mom's attorney objected twice during my testimony, but the judge overruled him both times. Then came cross-examination. The defense attorney asked if I loved my mother, if I appreciated her sacrifices, if I'd ever considered that maybe she deserved help from the daughter she'd raised alone. He asked why I'd given her a key if I didn't trust her, why I'd loaned her money if I expected it back, why I couldn't share my 3-bedroom house with family who needed shelter. The prosecutor's objections protected me from the worst attacks, and I stuck to the script we'd practiced, answering each question calmly with facts instead of emotions. Gracie Wallace took the stand the next day, and her testimony destroyed any remaining credibility Mom's defense had. She explained her credentials as a forensic document examiner, then methodically walked the jury through every element of the forged deed. The signature didn't match my actual signature patterns in multiple specific ways. The notary seal was fake, using a design that hadn't been in use for 5 years. The paper stock was wrong for official county documents. The formatting didn't match authentic deed transfers from that time period. She showed comparison charts and enlargements, pointing out each discrepancy with scientific precision. The jury leaned forward in their seats, paying close attention as she explained how professional forgers made mistakes that experts could catch. Mom's attorney tried to suggest the differences could be explained by normal signature variation, but Gracie shut him down with technical details about pressure points and stroke patterns. By the time she finished, there was no question the deed was fake. Grandpa testified on the 3rd day, and watching him was painful in ways I hadn't expected. He sat in the witness box looking older than I remembered, his hands shaking slightly as he answered the prosecutor's questions. He claimed Mom had manipulated him into believing the deed was real and necessary for tax purposes. She'd told him I'd already agreed to sign the house over but needed it done officially for legal reasons. He said he'd trusted his daughter and never thought to question whether the document was legitimate. Whether he was lying to save himself or telling the truth about being manipulated, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter legally because Mom had clearly created the forgery, and Grandpa's testimony about her convincing him it was real just made her look worse. Mom's attorney tried to suggest Grandpa was confused or misremembering, but he stuck to his story. My grandfather had thrown my mother under the bus to avoid prison time, and I felt nothing watching it happen. The jury got the case on Friday afternoon after closing arguments. I went home and tried to distract myself with work emails, but I couldn't focus on anything. Roger called at 4:30 to say the jury had reached a verdict after only 3 hours of discussion. We rushed back to the courthouse and I sat in the gallery while the jury filed in. The foreperson stood when the judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. Guilty on all charges: forgery, fraud, and attempted theft by deception. Mom's face went white as the verdicts were read, her mouth opening slightly like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. I felt relief wash over me, followed immediately by grief that surprised me with its intensity. This was my mother being convicted of trying to steal my house, and part of me still wanted to believe she hadn't really meant it. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Mom's attorney asked for bail to continue, but the prosecutor argued she was now a convicted felon and a flight risk. The judge agreed and remanded her to custody until sentencing. 2 weeks later, I sat in the same courtroom for sentencing. The judge had read all the pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. She looked at Mom and talked about the unique betrayal of a parent exploiting their child's trust, about forging legal documents to steal property, about the pattern of financial manipulation that had preceded this crime. She sentenced Mom to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay full restitution of $40,000. The judge's comments about betraying her daughter's trust and exploiting family bonds for personal gain validated everything I'd been feeling for months. Mom cried as they led her away, but I noticed she didn't look at me once during the entire hearing. Roger called me the next morning with news about the civil case. Mom's parents wanted to settle immediately to avoid their own trial, now that the criminal conviction made the forgery undeniable. They were offering $30,000 from the sale of some property they owned in another state. It was less than I was owed, but Roger explained it was likely all I'd realistically collect, even if I won a larger judgment. Mom had no assets and would be in prison, my uncles and aunts had nothing worth taking, and my grandparents' property sale was probably the only real money I'd ever see. I accepted the settlement as partial justice, knowing full accountability was impossible when dealing with people who had nothing to take. The final manipulation attempt came 3 months into Mom's sentence, delivered through a letter from Hui. He wrote that Mom was suicidal in prison, that she couldn't survive the full sentence, that she needed her daughter's forgiveness to find the will to live. He begged me to visit her, to write to her, to give her some hope that our relationship could be repaired. I read the letter twice, then showed it to Shanti during our next session. She helped me see it for what it was, a last attempt to use guilt to force me back into their control. Mom wasn't suicidal. She was angry that her manipulation hadn't worked, and desperate to find new leverage. I didn't respond to the letter and didn't visit the prison. The boundaries I'd finally established had given me peace, and I wasn't going to destroy that for another round of manipulation. 6 months after the invasion, I refinanced my mortgage to remove every trace of Mom from my financial paperwork. The bank had listed her as an emergency contact on the original loan documents, and seeing her name there made my skin crawl. I updated all my legal documents at the same time, changing beneficiaries and power of attorney designations, removing her from my life insurance and retirement accounts. The loan officer who processed the refinance was efficient and professional, never asking why I needed to remove my mother from everything. The process took 3 weeks and cost me closing fees, but it felt like cleansing my house of the last traces of her presence and control. When the new mortgage documents arrived with only my name on them, I filed them carefully in my safe deposit box and felt something release in my chest. I met someone at a coffee shop 3 months after the trial ended. One of my work friends dragged me to a networking thing I didn't want to attend, and he was there talking about project management systems with the kind of enthusiasm that made boring topics interesting. We started talking about software integration and somehow ended up discussing terrible family dynamics, and I found myself telling him the basics about the invasion, without the usual shame that came with admitting my mother tried to steal my house. He didn't look at me with pity or judgment, just nodded and said his sister had stolen from their parents for years before anyone acknowledged the problem. We exchanged numbers and started texting about work stuff that gradually became personal stuff, and when he asked me to dinner, I said yes without the panic I expected to feel. The first date felt easy in ways I didn't know dates could feel. No games or manipulation or hidden agendas, just 2 people eating pasta and talking about their lives. My therapist smiled when I told her about him during our next session, explaining that my ability to trust him showed I was learning to distinguish between people who earned trust through consistent behavior and people who demanded it through family obligation. She pointed out that I'd been testing his trustworthiness unconsciously through small things, watching how he responded when I set boundaries or said no to plans, and he'd passed every test by respecting my choices without making me feel guilty. That distinction felt huge. the difference between someone who proved themselves trustworthy and someone who insisted I owe them trust just because we share DNA. The first restitution payment arrived 6 weeks after sentencing, deposited automatically into my account on the 15th of the month. I checked my banking app 3 times to make sure the amount was real: $500 from Mom's prison wages and my grandparents' property sale settlement. The money felt different from the loans I'd given over the years, not a gift I'd never see again, but actual accountability in digital form. I transferred it immediately to my retirement account, watching my balance increase and thinking about the secure future my family had tried to steal. Each month, the payment appeared like clockwork, proof that consequences existed even in family situations, that courts could enforce justice even when manipulation had failed. I started planning what I'd do with the accumulated restitution, not spending it on immediate needs, but building the financial security I should have had all along if I hadn't been funding my family's dysfunction. By month 4, the payments felt routine rather than surprising, just another line item in my budget that represented freedom rather than obligation. My boss called me into her office 7 months after the invasion to discuss a promotion opportunity in the regional office 2 states away. The position came with a significant raise and expanded responsibilities, managing a larger team in a growing market that needed experienced leadership. She explained I was her first choice for the role based on my performance and the way I'd handled the personal crisis without letting it affect my work quality. I sat in her office looking at the job description and realized nothing tied me to this city anymore. My family was gone, scattered or imprisoned or cut off by restraining orders. My house held memories I wanted to leave behind, rooms my relatives had invaded and spaces that would always remind me of betrayal. The friends I'd made through work could stay in touch regardless of location, and my boyfriend had mentioned his job was remote flexible if things got serious between us. I told my boss I needed 2 days to think about it, but I already knew my answer before I left her office. This was my chance to build a completely new life in a place my family had never touched, where no one knew about the invasion or the trial or the years of manipulation that preceded it. I accepted the promotion the next morning and put my house on the market that same afternoon. The realtor walked through taking photos while I felt only relief at leaving behind the place my family had invaded, the rooms they'd reorganized and the spaces they'd claimed as their own. She suggested some staging improvements, but I told her to list it as is, wanting it sold quickly rather than perfectly. A young couple came to the first showing and fell in love with the house immediately, talking excitedly about which room would be the nursery and where they'd put their furniture. I watched them examine the kitchen where Mom had made sandwiches like she owned the place, and I felt happy knowing the house would have better memories with them than it ever had with my family. They made an offer the next day, slightly below asking price but close enough that I accepted without negotiating. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving me time to pack and prepare for the move while my new job waited for my start date. The house sold for significantly more than I'd paid 3 years earlier, the market having appreciated faster than I'd expected in my neighborhood. After paying off the remaining mortgage and covering closing costs, I walked away with almost $90,000 in profit that became the down payment on a beautiful condo in my new city. I flew out twice to look at properties, rejecting the first few because they felt too similar to my old house, or had layouts that reminded me of the invasion. The condo I finally chose was nothing like my previous home, modern and open with floor-to-ceiling windows and a completely different floor plan that held no triggering memories. I picked out every detail myself during the buying process, from the paint colors to the light fixtures to the window treatments, creating a space that was entirely mine without anyone's input or criticism. The mortgage payment was lower than my old house despite the condo being nicer, and I set up the extra money to go straight into savings alongside the restitution payments. Moving day felt like shedding an old skin, watching the movers load my furniture while I left behind the violated space my family had tried to claim. My new job started 3 weeks after I moved, and the challenge of learning new systems and meeting new colleagues kept me too busy to dwell on the past. The team I managed was smart and motivated, genuinely excited about the projects we were developing rather than just collecting paychecks. My boss in the new office was supportive without being intrusive, checking in on my transition while respecting my boundaries about my personal life. I made friends with several colleagues quickly, people who invited me to happy hours and weekend activities without any manipulation or exploitation attached to the invitations. 2 months into the job, I hosted my first dinner party in the new condo, cooking for 6 people who arrived on time with wine and genuine interest in getting to know me better. We ate and talked and laughed without any drama or hidden agendas, and I realized this was what healthy relationships felt like. People who respected boundaries and celebrated successes without trying to take anything from me. One of my colleagues mentioned how nice it was that I seemed so grounded and confident, and I almost laughed thinking about the invasion and trial that had forced me to develop those qualities through pure survival. The notification arrived exactly 1 year after the invasion, a form letter from the State Corrections Department informing me that Mom had been released on probation, after serving her full sentence with no early release for good behavior. I read it twice while eating breakfast in my sunny condo kitchen, and the news barely affected me because I'd built a life she had no access to or knowledge of. She didn't know my new address or my new job or my new city, didn't know about my boyfriend or my friends, or the promotion that had given me this fresh start. The restraining order remained in effect regardless of her release, and I'd already updated all my contact information with the court to ensure any violation attempts would be caught immediately. I filed the notification in my records folder and finished my coffee, thinking briefly about the woman who'd tried to steal my house and feeling nothing but distance. Whatever she did with her probation and her future was no longer my concern, and the indifference I felt proved how completely I'd moved on from the family that had controlled my entire life. My boyfriend invited me to meet his family 4 months into our relationship, a casual Sunday dinner at his parents' house that made me more nervous than any work presentation. I'd told him the basics about my family situation by then, enough that he understood my hesitation about family dynamics, and promised his parents were normal in ways that wouldn't trigger me. We drove to their house in the suburbs, and I practiced breathing exercises in the passenger seat, preparing for judgment or interrogation, or the subtle manipulation I'd learned to expect from family gatherings. His mother answered the door with a genuine smile and hugged me like she meant it, saying she was glad to finally meet me without any hidden agenda in her voice. His father shook my hand and offered me a drink, and his sister asked about my job with real interest rather than jealousy or competition. We ate dinner around their table and the conversation flowed naturally. No guilt trips or demands or passive-aggressive comments about my choices. They asked about my move and my new city without prying into why I'd relocated, and when I mentioned I didn't talk to my family anymore, his mother just nodded and said some families were toxic, and it took strength to walk away. I almost cried at the casual acceptance, the lack of pressure to reconcile or forgive or maintain contact with people who'd hurt me. This was what normal families looked like, I realized. People who respected boundaries and supported each other without exploitation or manipulation. My therapy appointment the following week focused on my progress over the past year, and Shanti suggested we discuss moving to occasional check-ins rather than weekly sessions. I'd processed the major trauma from the invasion and the trial, developed healthy coping skills for managing guilt and boundary setting, and built a new life that reflected my values rather than my family's demands. She walked me through the work I'd done, from that first session where I could barely talk about the invasion, without crying, to now where I could discuss my family with calm detachment. I felt proud of the healing I'd accomplished, the way I'd learned to distinguish between healthy and toxic relationships, the boundaries I'd established that protected my peace without apology. We scheduled monthly check-ins for the next 6 months with the understanding that I could always return to weekly sessions if needed, but both of us felt confident I had the tools to maintain my progress independently. Walking out of her office that day felt different from previous appointments, less like seeking help and more like touching base with someone who'd guided me through the hardest year of my life. My boyfriend proposed 2 years after we started dating, on a quiet Saturday morning in our shared condo after we'd moved in together 6 months earlier. He didn't make a big production of it, just asked while we were drinking coffee on the couch if I wanted to build a life together officially. I said yes without the panic or doubt I might have felt before the invasion taught me who deserved my trust and commitment. Planning our wedding involved none of the drama I'd always associated with family events. No fights over guest lists or seating arrangements or whose opinion mattered most. His family embraced me completely during the planning process, his mother helping with vendor selections without trying to control my choices, his sister offering to help with whatever I needed without expecting anything in return. We kept the wedding small and intimate, inviting only people who'd earned their place in our lives through genuine care and respect. I didn't send an invitation to Mom or any of my relatives, didn't even consider it because they'd lost the right to celebrate my happiness when they tried to steal my home and my future. Standing with my fiancé looking at wedding venues and tasting cakes and choosing flowers, I realized I was building the chosen family I'd always deserved. People who loved me without conditions or manipulation, who celebrated my success without trying to take anything from me. The wedding day arrived 6 months after the engagement, and I stood in the small room at the venue checking my reflection in the mirror one last time. My dress was simple and elegant, nothing like the elaborate gowns Mom always said I should wear when I got married someday. The thought of her crossed my mind for just a second, along with Dad, and I felt that familiar ache for what could have been if things had been different. But then I heard laughter from the main room where my friends were gathering, my boyfriend's family talking and joking, and I realized I didn't need the family I was born into when I had this one instead. These people loved me without asking for anything back, without keeping score of favors or loans, without making me feel guilty for having boundaries. Walking down the aisle toward my soon-to-be husband, I saw faces that represented genuine care and respect, people who celebrated my success instead of trying to take from it. The ceremony was short and personal, vows we wrote ourselves about building a life based on trust and honesty, and when we kissed as husband and wife, I felt completely free from the guilt that had controlled me for so long. The reception was exactly what we wanted, small and intimate with dancing and good food and toasts that made everyone laugh. My new mother-in-law hugged me and whispered that she was so happy to have me in their family, and I believed her because she'd never once tried to manipulate or use me. Standing with my husband in our condo later that night, surrounded by friends who stayed to help us celebrate, I looked around at the life I'd built after the invasion and realized something important. That terrible day when I came home to find my family in my house, when Mom tried to steal everything I'd worked for, that was actually the moment that set me free. The invasion forced me to see the truth about who they were and what they'd been doing to me for years, and breaking away from them let me become the person I was always supposed to be. I had a career I loved, a husband who respected me, friends who genuinely cared about my happiness and financial security I'd earned through my own hard work. The $30,000 in restitution couldn't replace the decades of manipulation, but it represented something more valuable, proof that I could stand up for myself and win. Looking at my husband's face as he smiled at something our friend was saying, I felt genuinely happy in ways I never thought possible back when I gave Mom that key and trusted her with access to my home.